The year was 1976. America was grappling with the knowledge that homosexuality was no longer considered a mental illness. And who was there to explain it to them? Bob Newhart, America's favorite psychiatrist. Well, not really, but he played one on TV. After the American Psychological Association decided that homosexuality was not a mental illness, the Bob Newhart Show didn't have to tackle the issue, but they did. So how did they do? Well, that is what I want to show you because it is fascinating. Hey, I'm Matt Baum. I make videos about LGBTQ milestones on TV and film, and before we get going, first we have to talk about who Bob Newhart is. He's the mouse from The Rescuers Down Under. But before that, he played the TV psychiatrist Bob Hartley on the show The Bob Newhart Show. Most of the jokes on the show were based around his goofy patience and his awkward demeanor, and watching it from today, there's also the added humor of how incredibly 70s the style is. If you want to watch it, I've got a link in the description for where you can find it streaming. And there's also a link to my Patreon if you're enjoying these videos and want to support me making more. The episode we're going to talk about is entitled Some of My Best Friends Are ... And it was directed by James Burrows, who also created Cheers, and he directed the gay episode of the show Phyllis, which is another video for another time. And by the way, I've got a link in the description for where you can find the pilot episode of Phyllis on VHS for the very reasonable price of $80. Anyway, in this episode of The Bob Newhart Show, his weekly therapy group is bored. They've heard all of each other's problems a million times already, and they want somebody new with new neuroses to worry about. This issue is brought up by an actor who also played Piglet in the Winnie the Pooh cartoons, and it's very weird to hear Piglet's voice complaining about psychiatry.
How about a manic depressive? At least they're fun half the time.
Also in this episode is the same actor who would play a gay guy on an episode of Night Court a decade later, but that's another video for another time. Bob isn't sure who he should bring in to the therapy group, but his secretary suggests a patient named Mr. Plager.
I think he'd fit in beautifully, Bob. He's a mild neurotic with compulsive tendencies.
By the way, his secretary is played by Marsha Wallace, who you might know as Edna Krabappel on The Simpsons. In this episode, she appears to be wearing a dress made entirely of bacon.
I never looked at it that way.
Anyway, Bob takes her suggestion and he invites the new patient to the group, Mr. Plager. Here he is arriving with an open shirt and mullet. He looks so 70s it actually seems like a modern-day costume of somebody in the 70s. Not long into the group session, he mentions his boyfriend, and we have your classic sitcom I can't believe it's not heterosexual moment.
Him?
Yes, him.
Wait a minute.
The group is actually very hostile to him, and there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about what gay means.
Oh! Then maybe you know my nephew, Kenny.
The nephew joke is actually pretty good, in part because I would actually like to meet Kenny. Everyone else in the group decides they need to leave early, and I gotta say, this scene had me feeling very tense. It's everyone's worst fears about coming out confirmed, that you're gonna alienate the people around you, people are gonna reject you, you might even be putting yourself in danger. Even Bob, his therapist, can't say the words gay or homosexual at first. And there's a moment where Mr. Plager walks behind Bob, and Bob has this take that's actually pretty funny. But that's not how you want your therapist to respond. So Bob has a dilemma here. The first is how he's going to deal with his group rejecting one of his patients. And the second is how he's going to deal with his own discomfort around having a homosexual patient. And weirdly, this is something that therapists were going through in real life, just around the time this episode was made. So this is the part where we have to talk about what was going on at the American Psychological Association in the early 1970s, when they completely changed their stance on homosexuality, transforming what everyone had assumed for decades. At the start of the 70s, virtually all psychiatrists just assumed gays were mentally ill. That was because for decades, the only homosexuals that the APA ever studied were people who had come to therapists for treatment, and also people who were in jail. This way of thinking was represented by the Old Guard, which was led by doctors like Charles Socarides and a guy named Irving Bieber, probably no relation to the other Bieber? Anyway, here's footage of Charles Socarides educating what was then the next generation of psychiatrists.
Homosexuality is in fact a mental illness which has reached epidemiological proportions.
Now, this old guard way of thinking was a problem for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's just not true. For another thing, it led to bizarre treatments for homosexuality, and I've got a whole other video about that on my channel. Stuff like giving people electroshock therapy while they're surrounded by jars of urine, making people bicycle endlessly, and also implanting monkey testicles in people.
a drug. It's made from monkey cum.
And another reason it was a problem was because it gave the public permission to look down on homosexuals as having this extra mental illness, just like Bob's group does. And the mental health field might still treat homosexuality as a mental illness today if it wasn't for three groups. The first was called the Gay PA. That was a group of secretly closeted psychiatrists in the APA. The second was a group of reformers who became known as the Young Turks. And the third was a group called the Gay Activists Alliance. They weren't a part of the APA at all. They were a bunch of outsiders who would invade the annual meetings in disguise and then stand up and shout down the doctors, demanding that they delist homosexuality as a mental illness. Working on their own, these groups weren't really able to accomplish very much. It was when they started working together that things started to change. It began when an activist named Barbara Giddings and another named Frank Kameny found a member of the Gay PA. His name was John Fryer, and they asked him to address the APA and ask them to delist homosexuality. He said, "Absolutely not, I'm not going to do it, it's too much of a professional risk, too much of a personal risk." But they kept asking, and eventually he was like, "Okay, fine, I'll do it if I can do it in disguise." Alright, so they found a disguise, a big tuxedo, a weird wig, and this mask that apparently was Richard Nixon.
Sock it to me?
He got up in front of everybody at the APA's annual meeting, that's Barbara Giddings and Frank Kameny next to him, and he gave a speech entitled, "I am a homosexual." There wasn't much of a change at first after that, but it got psychiatrists thinking, maybe it's time that we rethought what we think we know about homosexuality. And that's when the Young Turks saw their chance. Elections for APA leadership were coming up, and the Young Turks ran a bunch of their members for office, and they won. The next year, they organized a debate at the annual meeting in Hawaii, the old guard versus the new guard, Charles Socarides versus the reformers. The debate happened, and it was kind of inconclusive. But the real action happened at a tiki bar that night. The Gay PA was throwing their annual party at this tiki bar, and one of the new leaders from the Young Turks decided he'd go and check it out. It just so happened that he sat on the nomenclature committee, the committee that decided what was a mental illness and what wasn't. So this guy goes to the tiki bar and he sees two very important things. The first is he sees just how many members the Gay PA has, how many homosexual therapists there are, and it makes him think, maybe we really are wrong about this being a mental illness. The second important thing that he sees is a guy in an army uniform who enters the bar, looks around, and bursts into tears. It turns out he's an army psychiatrist. He saw the debate earlier that night, and he decided that it was so meaningful and moving that it was time for him to come out and seek other people like him. So this guy in the nomenclature committee has seen enough. He decides it's time for a change. He goes back to the hotel that night and drafts the resolution that will delist homosexuality as a mental illness. As a result, in 1974, the APA announces homosexuality no longer a disease. Everyone who was previously considered mentally ill, instantly cured. Of course, Charles Socarides was furious about this. Here's another clip of him arguing with Frank Kameny about what happened.
The views which you express, as indicated by a poll which was initiated by you yourself of the American Psychiatric Association, represents the views of a minority of psychiatrists.
Mr. Kameny, the poll, I'm afraid, is a fraud. Because
losers in votes always say that.
Well, I want to tell you something.
Obviously, Socarides is on the wrong side of history here. Change was happening, both in the medical field and also with public attitudes once it was announced, hey, these people aren't mentally ill. And that's exactly the conclusion that Bob comes around to in this episode, in part because of a tuxedo. You see, there's this B-plot in the episode about Bob finding his old tuxedo from college and trying it on. His neighbor Howard comes over and starts making fun of Bob's admittedly kind of ridiculous tuxedo. He calls it a sissy tuxedo, and Bob realizes how hurtful that language is. He corrects Howard.
It just happens that I happen to have a patient now who's gay, and he's going through a very difficult time. I'm beginning to understand why. I mean, some of the remarks you're making can be very hurtful.
That's pretty strong language, but then he goes even further with a little epiphany.
Howard, all I'm trying to say is we're going to have to change our attitude a little bit. It's just that kind of dark ages thinking that have kept homosexuals in closets all these years.
Well, they were probably in there looking for shirts like that.
I'm a little annoyed that the homophobe gets a funny joke in this scene, but I'll allow it. The next week, it's time for group therapy again, and Mr. Plager's the only one who shows up. He's feeling pretty sad about it. He realizes he's been rejected.
For the first time in my life, I feel sad to be gay.
That line is such a bummer. I feel so sad when someone says that they don't like being gay because it is great. It's your superpower. Anyway, the group shows up eventually and announces they took a vote and they want Mr. Plager out. But Bob stands by him with surprising vigorousness here. Listen to what he says.
If anyone's leaving, it's not going to be you. You know, I'm really ashamed of you. I never realized how narrow-minded you are.
I would be pretty upset if my therapist said that she was disappointed in me, which ironically just confirms that I need more therapy. Anyway, Bob says to them that despite their differences, we're all just people, and we need each other if we're going to get better.
And when you realize that people need people, you'll find that we're the luckiest people in the world.
Once again, Barbara saves the day.
I think we've learned something very valuable here today.
Yeah, I think we learned a new song.
Mr. Plager's a very special gay character here because he actually comes back in a later episode. He's a recurring gay, not like the one-and-done gay guest stars that would appear on most TV shows. And something that I love about this episode is that it takes something that was, frankly, kind of a boring medical procedural thing happening in real life and makes it personal. It explains why delisting homosexuality impacts people on a personal level. The show's essentially saying, look, this is a whole new world. You can't be jerks like you used to be. And it feels pretty good to be defended by a mental health professional, even though he's actually a comedian. But still, knowing that he's echoing what actual doctors were saying at the time, that feels great. Watching this episode from modern times, I realized just how lucky we are to be living when we're living, and that the APA took away at least one of our problems, so now I can deal with my actual neurotic tendencies. Thanks for watching, thanks to everyone who subscribes, and remember to hit that subscribe bell so you know when I've got a new video, and big thanks to everyone who makes my videos possible on Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/mattbound to check out the rewards for backers. Also, thanks to everyone who gave me feedback on this new video format that I'm trying out. Doing them like this lets me release them more frequently. So let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in videos like this. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm waiting for my new heart.